Roman Nose and Captain Jack, Native Warriors Against Manifest Destiny, 1873. A general's skull is cleaved in half by a Modoc leader. "I kill to save my people," Captain Jack declared, after assassinating General Canby. Yet within months, he swung from a gallows, his corpse stolen for a circus sideshow. Meanwhile, Roman Nose's war bonnet, imbued with sacred power, failed him over a dinner mistake. Were these men doomed by curses or crushed by an expanding nation? Their legends whisper a haunting question. What price did Native America pay for resisting manifest destiny? Roman Nose, spiritual warrior and military strategist of the Cheyenne. In the northern territories of the American Great Plains, a child born around 1823 into the northern Sutai band of the Cheyenne tribe would grow to become one of the most formidable military leaders of his era. Initially called Bat, this future warrior emerged during a pivotal period when the fur trade brought unprecedented numbers of white trappers and settlers into traditional tribal lands. As he matured, tribal elders recognized his natural aptitude for combat and strategy. After completing rigorous warrior training in horsemanship, weaponry, and spiritual practices, he received a more dignified name. By the 1850s, white settlers commonly referred to him as Roman Nose, a simplification of his Cheyenne name that spread as his reputation grew. Roman Nose possessed extraordinary leadership, abilities that transcended tribal boundaries. Standing over 6 feet tall with commanding presence, he carried himself with the bearing of a war chief. Though he declined formal civil leadership positions, stating that his efforts serve our people better on the battlefield than in council meetings, younger warriors naturally gravitated toward him, creating an informal influence network that extended his tactical reach. His battlefield innovations proved remarkably effective against U.S. forces. Roman Nose frequently led deceptive frontal charges against Army positions, drawing concentrated fire before abruptly wheeling his horse parallel to enemy lines. This forced soldiers to waste ammunition, while revealing their positions to Cheyenne warriors waiting in reserve. During an 1866 engagement near Fort Phil Kearny, he successfully led a small decoy party that lured Army forces into a carefully prepared ambush, allowing the Cheyenne to inflict casualties while suffering minimal losses. The spiritual dimension of Roman Nose's leadership proved equally important. He approached warfare as a deeply spiritual undertaking, rising before other warriors to spend hours in meditation and prayer. Between military engagements, he isolated himself for vision quests lasting 4 days or more, engaging in fasting and ritualized suffering to purify his spirit and strengthen supernatural connections. Central to his spiritual practice was his famous war bonnet, which reportedly carried extraordinary protective powers. Created by a medicine man named Ice, through ceremonial processes spanning several months, the bonnet featured a distinctive sweep of eagle feathers that made Roman Nose instantly recognizable on the battlefield. Its protection came with strict conditions. He could never shake hands with white men, nor eat food touched by iron implements, taboos reflecting Cheyenne beliefs about spiritual contamination. Both Native allies and U.S. military personnel described instances where bullets seemed to pass harmlessly around Roman Nose despite his prominent position during attacks. This apparent invulnerability enhanced his tactical advantages, while inspiring confidence in his warriors. As one U.S. cavalry officer wrote, "The Indian chief with the distinctive headdress rode directly through our volleys without falling. My men began to whisper that he could not be killed by our weapons." By 1867, Roman Nose had explicitly rejected white expansion into Cheyenne territory, declaring, "I will fight until no white man walks on Cheyenne land without our permission." This uncompromising stance consolidated his support among warriors frustrated by territorial encroachment despite previous peace agreements. His vow never to surrender to U.S. authorities would ultimately lead him to the confrontation at Beecher Island in 1868, where the consequences of breaking sacred taboos would intersect with frontier warfare, forever altering the course of Cheyenne resistance. Notable battles and actions of Roman Nose before Beecher Island. Around 1860, Roman Nose embarked on what would become nearly a decade of fierce resistance against American westward expansion. His military campaign began along the Oregon Trail, where it crossed traditional Cheyenne territory. This strategic location allowed him to monitor migration patterns and selectively target vulnerable wagon trains moving through contested lands. One of his most decisive early engagements occurred against a Mormon wagon train journeying toward Salt Lake City. Roman Nose studied the caravan's defensive formation, noting how the settlers had arranged their wagons in a protective circle with livestock corralled safely in the center. The Mormon men stood guard at intervals around the perimeter, but their numbers proved insufficient against Roman Nose's tactical approach. He led warriors in a series of high-speed circular charges around the wagon fortress. His horse thundered past the defensive line as he fired arrows with deadly precision. With each pass, Roman Nose eliminated another defender while remaining in constant motion to avoid return fire. The surviving Mormon guards found themselves unable to track his rapid movement patterns or predict where he would appear next. This simple yet effective tactic reduced the defensive capacity of the wagon train until the remaining settlers surrendered. Roman Nose's extraordinary physical abilities extended beyond battlefield tactics. During a buffalo hunt with his brother-in-law, he demonstrated reflexes and horsemanship that became legendary among the Cheyenne. The two warriors agreed to a hunting challenge. Each would carry only one arrow to take down a buffalo. As Roman Nose prepared to release his arrow at a massive bull, his brother-in-law accidentally pulled his bowstring too hard, sending his arrow flying uselessly skyward. In a display of remarkable coordination, Roman Nose first fired his own arrow, striking his intended target squarely. Without pausing, he spurred his horse forward at full gallop, positioned himself beneath the errant arrow's trajectory, and caught it bare-handed in mid-flight. In one fluid motion, he knocked the captured arrow and shot the second buffalo before either animal could escape. His brother-in-law's honor remained intact, and the story spread through Cheyenne camps as evidence of Roman Nose's exceptional capabilities. Beyond his martial prowess, Roman Nose demonstrated social intelligence and loyalty that earned him respect in diplomatic contexts. A notable example involved his friendship with a Sioux warrior who had unsuccessfully courted a young Cheyenne woman. After listening to his friend's frustrations, Roman Nose devised a creative solution. He approached the young woman directly, using his considerable status to arrange a romantic meeting for the following evening, a common courtship practice among Plains tribes. The Cheyenne woman arrived at the designated location, expecting to meet Roman Nose, but instead found his Sioux friend waiting. By the time she realized the substitution had occurred, the couple had already spent enough time together to establish a connection. Their relationship flourished, eventually resulting in marriage. The woman later acknowledged that Roman Nose's deception had ultimately led to her happiness, while the Sioux warrior maintained lifelong gratitude for his friend's intervention. Roman Nose's military activities intensified dramatically after the 1864 Sand Creek Massacre, when U.S. Colonel John Chivington led volunteer troops in an unprovoked attack on a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village, killing over 150 native people, mostly women, children, and elderly. This atrocity transformed Roman Nose's resistance from selective raids into systematic warfare against U.S. interests throughout the region. In January 1865, he coordinated multiple attacks on Julesburg, Colorado, destroying the settlement and disrupting telegraph communications between Denver and points east. He targeted transportation infrastructure and military outposts across southern Wyoming, effectively halting white travel through the region for several months. Throughout the Platte River Valley in Kansas and Nebraska, Roman Nose led raids on stagecoach stations, ranches, and smaller settlements, creating a zone of native control that temporarily reversed the tide of American expansion. When the U.S. government negotiated the Little Arkansas Treaty of 1865, attempting to confine southern Cheyenne to a reservation in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, Roman Nose rejected its terms outright. He considered the agreement a betrayal of Cheyenne sovereignty and refused to recognize its legitimacy. Instead, he forged alliances with the militant Dog Soldier Society of the Cheyenne, whose members had similarly rejected reservation life. This coalition focused its efforts on protecting traditional hunting grounds along the Smoky Hill River and the Republican River Valley. These areas held both practical and spiritual significance. They contained the last substantial buffalo herds accessible to the Cheyenne and represented ancestral territories central to tribal identity. Roman nose coordinated a series of military actions designed to disrupt settlement and transportation in these regions, while minimizing direct confrontation with large army units. By 1868, Roman nose had established himself as the foremost military threat to American expansion in the Central Plains. As U.S. military planners developed new strategies to neutralize his influence, the stage was set for the confrontation at Beecher Island that would ultimately determine his place in history. The Battle of Beecher Island and the death of Roman Nose. September 1868 marked the final chapter in Roman Nose's resistance campaign. The confrontation at Beecher Island, a small sandbar in the Arickaree River in eastern Colorado, would prove decisive not only for the Cheyenne warrior, but for native resistance across the Central Plains. Days before the battle, Roman Nose visited a friendly Sioux encampment to participate in a tribal feast celebrating recent successful hunts. Among the foods served was fried bread, a staple that had become common in native diets by the 1860s. Unknown to Roman Nose, the bread had been removed from the cooking oil using an iron fork, a seemingly trivial detail that carried profound spiritual implications. Roman Nose consumed the bread along with other guests, unaware of the taboo violation. The transgression remained undiscovered until hours before the second day of fighting at Beecher Island, when a Cheyenne warrior who had attended the same feast realized what had occurred and felt obligated to inform him. The news struck Roman Nose with unprecedented force. For the first time in his military career, the confident leader appeared paralyzed with indecision. According to warriors present in his camp, he retreated to his lodge and sat motionless for several hours. The spiritual protection of his war bonnet, the source of his battlefield invulnerability, had been compromised by the violation of sacred prohibitions. "I have eaten food touched by iron," he reportedly told his close associates. "The medicine of my war bonnet is broken. If I fight today, I will die." Rather than immediately joining the battle, Roman Nose considered performing a purification ritual to restore the bonnet's protective powers. Such ceremonies typically required specific preparations and significant time, resources unavailable in the midst of active combat. As he deliberated, an elderly Cheyenne woman named White Contrary approached his lodge. White Contrary delivered a sharp rebuke that cut through his spiritual crisis. "While you sit here, young men die defending our hunting grounds," she reportedly said. "Will Roman Nose be remembered as one who hid while others fought?" This challenge to his honor proved decisive. Roman Nose emerged from his lodge and began preparing for battle. He applied his war paint with methodical precision and placed the war bonnet upon his head. To his warriors he announced, "Today I will lead one final charge. The power of my medicine is broken, but my courage remains." Alternative accounts from U.S. military sources offer a different perspective on Roman Nose's death, focusing on tactical rather than spiritual factors. These reports suggest that early in the battle, Roman Nose had ordered an aggressive frontal assault on the island, promising to award his personal war bonnet to the first warrior who reached the American position. This approach proved costly as Major George Forsyth's scouts had established effective defensive positions using the island's natural features. After the initial assault failed with significant Cheyenne casualties, Roman Nose recognized the need for more direct leadership. Learning that Major Forsyth had been wounded, he determined to capitalize on this advantage by personally leading a second assault. Around midday on September 17th, he gathered approximately 100 warriors for a coordinated attack. The U.S. scouts, though outnumbered and running low on ammunition, maintained disciplined fire from their shallow rifle pits. As Roman Nose led the charge across the shallow river and onto the island, multiple witnesses described his commanding presence. Lieutenant Frederick Beecher, for whom the island would later be named, observed that the Cheyenne leader rode slightly ahead of his warriors, making him a visible target despite the tactical disadvantage this created. Despite reaching the island and inflicting casualties on the American forces, Roman Nose was struck by a bullet at close range during intense fighting. The shot hit him in the abdomen, a wound recognized as fatal by both Roman Nose and his warriors. His followers carried him from the battlefield to a nearby ravine, where he lingered until evening before succumbing to his injury. The battle continued for several more days, but the Cheyenne fighting spirit diminished significantly after Roman Nose's fall. By September 25th, when relief forces arrived to rescue Forsyth's beleaguered scouts, the Cheyenne had withdrawn from the area. The death of Roman Nose marked the beginning of the end for effective large-scale native resistance in the Central Plains. Roman Nose's death in 1868 dramatically altered Cheyenne resistance capabilities. Within 2 years, most northern Cheyenne bands were forced onto reservations. Their military resistance effectively ended. U.S. military leaders acknowledged his tactical genius, with General William T. Sherman later noting that Roman Nose had been the most formidable of all Plains warriors they encountered. The Cheyenne preserved his memory through oral histories that emphasized his courage and battlefield prowess. His war bonnet became a powerful cultural symbol, with replicas created for ceremonial purposes that continue to the present day. Several Cheyenne military societies maintained specific rituals, honoring his contributions to their defensive traditions. For decades after his death, U.S. military academies studied his tactics for countering superior firepower through mobility and deception. His approach to guerrilla warfare, targeting supply lines and communications rather than confronting main forces, influenced military thinking about asymmetric conflict. Today, Roman Nose is commemorated in Wyoming's Roman Nose State Park and through various historical markers across the Plains states. The Cheyenne Nation continues to honor him as a defender of tribal sovereignty and traditional lands who chose to fight rather than surrender, even when victory seemed impossible. Modoc leaders fight for ancestral homeland. In the Pacific Northwest, as American settlers pushed westward in the mid-19th century, a Modoc leader named Kinpuash emerged as a formidable defender of indigenous territorial rights. Born in the early 1800s, Kinpuash grew up among the Modoc people, whose ancestral territory spanned approximately 5,000 square miles along the California-Oregon border. Tule Lake formed the heart of this homeland, providing abundant resources that had sustained his people for millennia. Unlike many tribal societies, the Modoc operated with leadership earned through demonstrated ability rather than heredity. Archaeological evidence confirms their presence in the region for over 8,000 years, during which they developed sophisticated resource management practices perfectly adapted to Tule Lake's unique ecology. This established way of life faced catastrophic disruption when California's gold rush brought miners, farmers, and ranchers flooding into the region during the 1840s-50s. By 1864, settlers viewed the fertile lands surrounding Tule Lake not as ancestral territory but as unused resources awaiting development. Despite Kinpuash's initial attempts at peaceful coexistence and diplomatic appeals to local authorities, federal policy increasingly favored native removal. In 1865, the government forcibly relocated Kinpuash and approximately 800 Modoc to the Klamath Reservation in southwestern Oregon, 60 miles from their homeland and among their historical enemies. White authorities derisively nicknamed Kinpuash Captain Jack, claiming his walk resembled a local character, a deliberate cultural dismissal symbolizing broader disregard for Modoc sovereignty. On the reservation, conditions proved intolerable. The numerically superior Klamath subjected Modoc families to systematic marginalization. They received inferior land allotments, faced discrimination in resource distribution, and endured harassment when practicing their cultural traditions. Rather than accepting this situation, Kinpuash organized strategic resistance. In late 1865, he led approximately 150 followers in a midnight exodus from the reservation, traveling south across the state line back to Tule Lake. For several months, they successfully maintained independence until 1869, when U.S. Army forces compelled their return to the reservation where conditions had further deteriorated. After unsuccessfully attempting to work within the system, requesting a separate Modoc reservation area away from Klamath interference, Kinpuash concluded peaceful solutions were exhausted. In April 1870, he executed a more comprehensive plan. Under cover of darkness, nearly half the tribe, approximately 380 people, followed him back to Tula Lake. This time they brought household goods, weapons, and supplies, signaling no intention of voluntary return. Kinpuash strategically established their settlement along the lake's southern shore, creating a defensible base, while simultaneously initiating diplomatic outreach to sympathetic local settlers. He attempted to secure recognition for a small, permanent Modoc homeland, a balanced approach combining defensive preparations with continued negotiation efforts. This pragmatic leadership would soon be tested, as federal authorities prepared a forceful response to what they viewed as unacceptable defiance, setting the stage for one of the costliest conflicts in the Indian Wars. Escalating conflict in the Battle of Lost River, April 1870, November 29, 1872. Between 1870 and 1872, a new wave of white settlers arrived in the Tula Lake region, drawn by railroad expansion and favorable land policies. These newcomers reacted with hostility to the Modoc presence, viewing them as obstacles to development rather than the land's rightful inhabitants. Settlers drafted formal complaints to federal authorities, demanding immediate removal of what they termed renegade Indians occupying prime agricultural land. Federal officials, having already invested considerable resources in previous Modoc removal efforts, responded with increasing frustration. In October 1872, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs instructed T.B. O'Donnell, the Oregon Superintendent of Indian Affairs, to coordinate with military personnel at Fort Klamath to forcibly return Kinpuash's band to the reservation. O'Donnell requested military support, emphasizing that the operation should proceed peaceably if possible, forcibly if necessary. On November 29, 1872, Captain James Jackson led 40 cavalry troops to the Modoc encampment at Lost River, near a location called Emigrant Crossing. Arriving at dawn, Jackson demanded immediate surrender and returned to the Klamath Reservation. Kinpuash, recognizing the soldiers' superior firepower, initially agreed to comply, rather than risk bloodshed. His decision reflected tactical pragmatism, rather than submission, a temporary concession, while he assessed available options. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Jackson, not content with verbal agreement, demanded immediate disarmament of all Modoc men. This unexpected requirement alarmed the Modoc warriors, who considered their weapons essential for hunting and protection. Nevertheless, Kinpuash began slowly surrendering his rifle, signaling for his men to follow suit despite their visible reluctance. The fragile peace shattered when a verbal altercation erupted between a Modoc warrior named Scarface Charlie and an army sergeant. Both men drew pistols and fired simultaneously, missing each other, but triggering an immediate chain reaction. Within seconds, the encampment exploded into violence, as Modoc men scrambled for weapons while soldiers opened fire. Amid the chaos, Kinpuash demonstrated remarkable leadership. Rather than allowing a disorganized last stand that would result in massacre, he called for strategic withdrawal. Using their superior knowledge of the terrain, the Modoc fighters provided covering fire, while women and children fled southward. After a brief but intense exchange, lasting approximately 20 minutes, Kinpuash successfully extracted most of his people from the encampment. Captain Jackson, having suffered several casualties, and recognizing his force was now overextended, ordered his troops to regroup rather than pursue. This tactical withdrawal by both sides temporarily paused direct confrontation, but the conflict had irrevocably escalated. Reports later confirmed that a separate group of settlers had attacked Modoc families on the opposite shore of Tula Lake during the same period, killing several women and children. Following the Lost River engagement, Kinpuash made a crucial strategic decision. Rather than fleeing randomly or attempting to surrender, he led his people approximately 35 miles south to an area known as the lava beds, a forbidding landscape of volcanic rock formations, caves, and natural trenches. This terrain, familiar to the Modoc but challenging for cavalry operations, offered exceptional defensive advantages. The lava bed's natural fortifications included a network of interconnected caves with multiple entrance and exit points, allowing defenders to move unseen while maintaining clear firing lines on approaching forces. Natural depressions in the landscape provided ready-made rifle pits, while the black volcanic rock offered near-perfect camouflage for Modoc fighters. Deeper caves provided secure shelter for non-combatants, with protected access to water sources that could sustain the group indefinitely. Within this natural fortress, Kinpuash established what military historians would later call Captain Jack's Stronghold, a defensive position so formidable that it would withstand repeated assaults by forces many times larger than the small Modoc band, which numbered fewer than 60 fighting men. The Modoc War and the death of General Canby, January 17, 1873, April 11, 1873. The U.S. military response to Kinpuash's defensive position demonstrated how seriously authorities viewed the situation. By January 1873, Brigadier General Edward Canby had assembled over 300 regular Army troops supplemented by volunteer militias. On January 17th, this force launched a coordinated attack against the Modoc stronghold, confident that superior numbers and firepower would quickly overcome resistance. The assault proved disastrous for the military. Advancing across open terrain toward concealed Modoc positions, the soldiers became easy targets for accurate rifle fire from defenders who remained virtually invisible among the dark rocks. After 6 hours of combat, Canby ordered withdrawal, having lost 35 men killed and many more wounded. The Modoc, employing carefully planned fields of fire and rotating fighting positions, suffered no casualties. This humiliating defeat prompted a fundamental reassessment of military strategy. General Canby, recognizing the prohibitive cost of direct assault, initiated parallel approaches, continuing military pressure, while establishing a peace commission to negotiate surrender terms. This dual strategy reflected growing concern in Washington about negative publicity surrounding the conflict, with some Eastern newspapers already portraying the Modoc as victims fighting for their homeland rather than hostile insurgents. Kinpuash, now commanding increased respect from military authorities, faced complex decisions about his next moves. His military success had strengthened his position, but he recognized the practical limits of continued resistance against the nation's full resources. When peace commissioners established contact in February 1873, he agreed to preliminary discussions while maintaining his defensive position. Throughout the peace talks, which stretched over several weeks, internal divisions among the Modoc intensified. A faction led by warriors Shanchin John and Hooker Jim advocated rejecting negotiations entirely, arguing that the government could not be trusted to honor any agreement. They proposed instead a bold strategy: assassinate the leadership of the Peace Commission to demoralize American forces and demonstrate Modoc resolve. Kinpuash initially rejected this approach, preferring to pursue a negotiated settlement that might allow the Modoc to establish a small reservation near their ancestral lands. His moderate position eroded as negotiations stalled, with commissioners insisting on unconditional surrender and return to the Klamath Reservation, the very conditions that had precipitated the conflict initially. As his influence over more militant faction members waned, Kinpuash faced a critical choice: maintain his opposition to violence against negotiators and risk losing leadership of the group, or demonstrate his commitment to Modoc independence through decisive action. Tribal accounts suggest his eventual decision came after significant pressure from warriors who questioned his courage and commitment. On April 11, 1873, Kinpuash and several warriors attended a scheduled peace commission meeting at a neutral location between army lines and the Modoc stronghold. They concealed pistols beneath their clothing, having carefully planned their actions. General Canby, Reverend Eliezer Thomas, and 2 other commissioners arrived unarmed, as agreed, expecting routine negotiations. When the meeting began, Kinpuash presented a final demand for a separate Modoc reservation. When Canby indicated this request exceeded his authority, Kinpuash uttered a prearranged signal phrase. The Modoc immediately drew their weapons. Kinpuash himself fired 2 shots at General Canby before drawing a knife to complete the attack. Simultaneously, his companions killed Reverend Thomas and wounded the other commissioners. The survivors fled as the Modoc returned to their stronghold. The assassination of General Canby, the only U.S. Army general killed during the Indian Wars, shocked the nation and transformed the conflict's nature. Any possibility of negotiated settlement vanished as the army prepared to respond with overwhelming force. Kinpuash had crossed a line that would define the remainder of his life and seal his place in American history. The downfall and death of Captain Jack, April 11, 1873, October 3, 1873. The assassination of General Canby transformed the Modoc War overnight. Within days, the U.S. Army in Northern California mobilized an overwhelming force of 1,000 soldiers and surrounded the lava beds. Colonel Alvin Gillum, assuming command after Canby's death, implemented a strategy combining artillery bombardment with systematic infantry advances. Recognizing the futility of defending their stronghold against such numbers, Kinpuash ordered an evacuation rather than face certain annihilation. The Modoc scattered in small groups across the harsh volcanic landscape, adopting guerrilla tactics that frustrated military pursuit. This strategic withdrawal preserved their fighting capacity, but marked the beginning of their decline as a unified force. Throughout late April and May, Kinpuash coordinated sporadic attacks against Army patrols, employing hit-and-run tactics that maximized Modoc mobility advantages. In one notable engagement at Dry Lake on May 10th, his warriors ambushed a cavalry unit, killing several soldiers, before disappearing into the rocky terrain. These tactical successes, however, could not compensate for the Modoc's dwindling resources and manpower. Internal cohesion within the Modoc band deteriorated rapidly. Food supplies diminished, ammunition grew scarce, and physical exhaustion from constant movement took its toll. By late May, several families had surrendered independently to Army outposts, preferring captivity to continued hardship. Each surrender weakened Kinpuash's position and provided military authorities with valuable intelligence about remaining Modoc movements. The final blow came when Hooker Jim, Bogus Charlie, and several other warriors, once among Kinpuash's most loyal supporters, negotiated separate surrender terms that included amnesty in exchange for tracking down their former leader. On May 27th, these Modoc scouts led Army units directly to Kinpuash's hidden camp near Willow Creek. Despite this betrayal, Kinpuash maintained his dignity. On June 1st, he formally surrendered, laying down his rifle and walking unarmed toward the soldiers, who had hunted him for months. Contemporary accounts describe his demeanor as solemn but resolute, speaking only to ensure proper treatment for the women and children in his group. Military authorities transported Kinpuash and his remaining warriors to Fort Klamath, where a military commission convened on July 1, 1873. The trial proceeded with minimal pretense of impartiality. The outcome was predetermined. Despite his attempts to explain the Modoc perspective and the conditions that had forced his people from their homeland, Kinpuash was quickly convicted of murder and violations of the laws of war. On October 3, 1873, Kinpuash and 3 companions, Shanchan John, Black Jim, and Boston Charlie, were hanged simultaneously on a purpose-built gallows at Fort Klamath. Before the execution, when asked if he wished to speak, Kinpuash reportedly stated, "I fought for my people and my land. I am ready to die." The remaining Modoc captives, approximately 155 people, were loaded onto trains and forcibly relocated to the Quapaw Agency in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, over 2,000 miles from their ancestral homeland. Their exile effectively ended the Modoc presence in the Tula Lake Basin, territory they had occupied continuously for thousands of years. The fate of Captain Jack's remains and his legacy. The controversy surrounding Kinpuash continued even after his death. Immediately following the execution, rumors circulated that his body had been transported to Eureka, California, for embalming and subsequent display in traveling exhibitions. These accounts, while sensational, masked a more disturbing reality. Army surgeons at Fort Klamath had secretly decapitated Kinpuash and his 3 companions immediately after the hanging. Their heads were preserved in alcohol-filled containers and shipped to Washington, D.C., where they arrived at the Army Medical Museum in late October 1873. This action, conducted without tribal consent or public knowledge, reflected the period's scientific racism that treated Native American remains as specimens for study rather than human remains deserving dignity. The museum maintained possession of Kinpuash's skull until 1898, when it transferred the remains to the Smithsonian Institution for Anthropological Research. There, scientists conducted measurements and studies based on the now discredited field of craniometry, which purported to determine intellectual and moral characteristics through skull measurements. For nearly a century, the Modoc people remained unaware of their leader's fate. Only in the 1970s, when Modoc descendants researching tribal history discovered documentation about the Smithsonian's collection, did the truth emerge. In 1984, the tribe formally petitioned for repatriation of Kinpwash's remains under emerging protocols, for returning Native American artifacts and remains to their original communities. The Smithsonian returned Kinpwash's skull in a private ceremony in 1984. Tribal elders interred the remains at an undisclosed location within the Klamath Reservation, though many Modoc believe their leader deserves final rest at Tula Lake in ancestral Modoc territory. A memorial marker at Fort Klamath now commemorates Kinpwash and acknowledges both his resistance and execution at the site. Today, the Modoc Nation in Oklahoma and Modoc descendants in Oregon and California continue efforts to honor Kinpwash's legacy through cultural revitalization programs and historical education. The Lava Beds National Monument preserves the landscape where he made his stand with interpretive materials, offering a more balanced presentation of the conflict than earlier accounts that portrayed him simply as a murderous renegade. Kinpwash's determination to protect Modoc homeland, his tactical brilliance against overwhelming odds, and his ultimate sacrifice have transformed him from a vilified adversary in 19th century accounts to a recognized symbol of indigenous resistance and cultural persistence. In contemporary understanding, Roman Nose and Captain Jack embodied native resistance through different methods: spiritual warfare on the plains and strategic defense in volcanic strongholds, yet met the same fate. Roman Nose fell to a bullet after his protective medicine failed. Kinpwash died on the gallows after betrayal ended his campaign. Separated by 5 years and vast distance, their defeats accelerated America's western conquest. The cost of resisting manifest destiny was uniform: leaders' deaths, tribal displacement, and cultural devastation.